we've heard from telephone calls that one plane is 2 hours late and one 1 hour late. They're expected momentarily, I hope. But I thought that there's no reason we cannot carry on some discussion and try and bring them up to date when they arrive. If you prefer to wait, just let me know. I'm prepared to negotiate. People know I'm a negotiator. I will discuss it anyway. This is one of a series of programs on South Africa conducted by the Institute of Politics here at the Kennedy School. We had one last spring in which all participants were South Africans, discussing South Africa. One of the few meetings where both representatives of the ANC and the government of South Africa participated in the same program, a credit to the Kennedy School, the Institute of Politics' spirit of mutual inquiry. There will be another meeting on South Africa in the near, not too distant future, in which it will consist of business interests, business concerns, business in South Africa, and investment in South Africa will be the subject. Now, tonight our concern is with the response from Washington. I hope it's not only response on purpose of activity, not simply reactive, but forward-looking, that we will have looking how should Washington deal with South Africa. The two speakers, I'll just tell you who's here. Jeff Davidow, our first on my right. We have two. He's a career Foreign Service officer, and Phil Christensen on my left, now with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as a Republican, the principal Republican staffer on Capitol Hill on African policy. I think it's fair to say, and Jeff didn't disagree with that allocation. Our program intended was to give each speaker about 10 minutes of opening comment. I will then rigorously cross-examine them before giving you a chance to do the same. And we will be out of here sometime between 9 and 9:30, depending on how interested we are and you are, and they are, how interesting they are. Interested they are. If they walk out, the time will stop sooner. But Jeff, don't leave. Let me give you a little more. I think we'll put you go first. The career Foreign Service officer. 10 years ago, he spent 2 years in South Africa. In '79, he was back in Rhodesia. He did some congressional staff work during '78 and '79. He was here at Harvard as a fellow at the Center for International Affairs in '82, '83, and he's currently Director of Southern African Affairs in the Bureau of African Affairs at the Department of State. Mr. Jeffrey Davidow. Jeff.
Do you want to put your watch down?
Oh, yes, very good. 10 minutes, Jeff.
Okay, fine. I apologize to the people behind me, and it is my personal testimony to my belief in the civility of Harvard audiences that I'm willing to turn my back on some of you. I hope I'm justified in that. Let me talk for a bit about South Africa, the situation there, and what I think is an appropriate American response to that situation. And I think I'm going to take something of a different tack because I think we've all heard the standard arguments one way or another about South Africa. South Africa is unique, just as the United States is unique. It's a product of its own history, its own geography, its own demography. But what's happening in South Africa is not totally unique. There are elements there in that historical drama, in that human drama, that we see elsewhere in the world. And I think it behooves us, when we study South Africa and what we should be doing in South Africa, not to view it solely as a separate case, quite divorced from world history, quite divorced from other things that we're seeing in the world. Basically, it seems to me what's happening in South Africa that gives that country its piquancy, its complexity, is the collapse of a particular form of political system. It is imploding on itself because of its inherent contradictions. Now, we've seen political systems collapse in the world. There are others that are collapsing now, and we can all come up with a list from our studies of history. What gives South Africa particular interest, it seems to me, is that we, in addition to that category of historical development, we have another reality, which is also not unique to South Africa, which is ethnic political division. That same kind of division that has given us the wonders of Lebanon, or Cyprus, or Northern Ireland, or parts of Boston and Chicago. That tension between ethnic groups, when overlaid, hi Greg. When overlaid on this implosion, gives, I think, South Africa its special significance. There is another element of South Africa, which is something actually that we create here, an element of the South African scene, in that the racial divisions in South Africa are particularly important to us because we are who we are, and our country has gone through what it has gone through, and therefore racial division, white, black, is particularly important to a lot of us for various reasons and from various perspectives. So we have a situation in South Africa where I think any reasonable person would acknowledge that that society is going to change and change fundamentally. The real question is, what kind of transition is going to take place there? And what is going to be at the end of the transition? And there are subsidiary questions. How the transition will take place, who will lead, how long it will take. But basically, there is a ferment in that society in which the majority of people, certainly the vast majority of blacks, and a majority of the whites realize that the old order must changeth. How is it going to change? If we have interests in South and Southern Africa, and I would sustain that indeed the United States does have important interests there, not only the human drama, but other things, more mundane things, such as minerals, such as a concern about the geopolitical situation. Let us not forget, and this is not a popular thing in some circles, that there are 30 to 35,000 Cuban troops, Soviet surrogate troops in Angola, one country away from South Africa. That's a fact of life that I don't think we can ignore. It doesn't justify supporting South Africa, it doesn't justify apartheid, but it forms part of the political context. All right, we have a society that has got to go through transition. Most of the people in that society recognize it, but quite frankly, most of the people in that society don't know how to begin. The blacks are angry, they're bitter, they are, in some measure, especially the young, prone to violence, either purposeful or random. The whites, for the most part, I think, are just damn scared. They don't know which way to go. A small percentage, an infinitesimal percentage, is willing to accept black demands now. A larger percentage, let's say a third or 40%, believes that they've just got to hold on to whatever the hell they have, make no changes at all, clamp down. And perhaps the majority, and I would put the current government in this, is mildly reformist. Change must come, they say, but they don't really know what kind of change, and they make offers of change which the blacks reject because they are perceived as risible, and indeed they are not significant changes. So you have this situation, and what is happening in South Africa today is this irony of a reformist in the South African government, in South African context, a reformist government engaged in moderate reform while also engaged in a cycle of violence and repression which vitiates the reform, and the stakes keep going up. What's the proper role for the United States in this? seems to me that we've got to first recognize the limits of our power. The U.S. is not going to make the big difference in South Africa. What happens in South Africa will be determined by the people who live there, whites and blacks. Secondly, it seems to me that the United States has got to make it absolutely clear that we do not support apartheid, that we do not support the government of South Africa in its racism. Now, earlier this month, or last month now, the President issued an executive order which instituted additional restrictions on our association with South Africa. It's important to keep in mind that the U.S.-South African relation for the last 20 years has not been business as usual. It is one of the most constrained, restricted relationships in terms of trade, commerce, issuances of visas, passports, things like that. But there are additional ones, and I think the message that the President was sending, and indeed the entire American body politic, is there's got to be change in that country, that there has to be real change, not the kind of simple change that the current government is talking about, and that we have sent, in doing so, sent a political signal to South Africa and to the South African government. I think the aim of the President's plans, or his executive order, and I think most of the people on Capitol Hill, but we have experts here from there, was to bring the South African government to its senses, not necessarily to its knees. Because I think we have to think about what is going to succeed this present corrupt system. In South Africa, and the people who live there, in our interest, are not going to be served by some sort of cataclysm in South Africa that will destroy that economy, create untold hardship for the people of that nation and for the people of the surrounding nations who depend very heavily on the South African economy. So we have to make clear our opposition to apartheid. We've got to send signals to the South African government. We also, it seems to me, have to urge the next step, and that next step has got to be negotiation. And I'm particularly pleased that Roger Fisher is here, because we want to draw on him. I often think of South Africans as well, maybe from Washington we're more aware of this, as the pandas in the National Zoo. You want to get offspring from the pandas, and they know what they're supposed to do roughly, but you really have to put them together to get it done. And basically, it seems to me that what we have in South Africa are a group of pandas. The whites and blacks have not come up with any valid negotiating strategies. They're playing end games. The whites, by and large, although they are open for change, the majority, are saying, God, you want me to commit suicide? That's what this means if I hand over to the blacks. And the blacks are saying, we'll meet you tomorrow on the steps of the Capitol building to accept your surrender sword. Somewhere in between that, credible white and black leaders have to come forth with tactics for negotiations, for strategies for change that make sense. And right now, that's not happening, and that's unfortunate. I frankly, and I'm being very open here, don't know if the United States has an integral role to play in that negotiating strategy. I don't know if we have sufficient credibility or influence among all of the parties, but it seems to me that we should not deviate from our goal, which is to influence the parties themselves, to urge the parties themselves, to begin the kind of negotiation that is desperately needed in South Africa, to turn that society away from racism, away from injustice, to something that is more equitable. If that doesn't happen, then that society is going to be in worse, increasingly worse shape for the foreseeable future, and we will be facing a cataclysm there. Let me stop there and allow my what do we say, esteemed colleagues to continue.
Thank you very much. Jeff, Greg, you a couple of minutes late. You didn't miss much. You came in after about...
Wait a second.
You came in after 120 seconds, which we had been talking in terms of time. The question is, what does the United States do about South Africa? And having gotten a good administration view, I would like to call on you to give us an alternative view. Let me welcome back to Harvard, an alumnus of the college. He misled himself and went to New Haven for law school, but we forgive all. He's a lawyer, used to be with the law firm of Williamson Connolly, and currently he is National Security Advisor to the senior senator from Massachusetts, Edward Kennedy. It's a pleasure to welcome back Mr. Gregory Craig. Greg. Make sure you got the microphone. So the people behind you will want.
Can I look at the people behind me?
Try.
It is difficult to realize how few lessons have been learned by the administration over the last 4 or 5 years as to the nature of the people that they're dealing with in South Africa. And I think probably this is the major disagreement with the critics, between the critics of administration policy and the people who have been the architects of constructive engagement. We don't disagree that South Africans, black and white, are ultimately going to decide what happens there. And we don't disagree that the United States has only... Chester Crocker serves you right. A limited amount of influence on events inside South Africa. I think it is true that South African blacks probably overestimate the amount of influence and responsibility the United States has inside South Africa. But certainly we have more than the South African government likes to admit. But the nature of the problem there doesn't seem to me to be so much in the nature of the black leadership, but in the nature of the white leadership. They are not like the French or the English or the Germans in their tradition of reformism or accommodationism. They have developed a political tradition that is based almost entirely on a confrontational and a disciplined obstructionism as the means for accomplishing their objectives. Moreover, as the last 4 or 5 years has demonstrated, and I think Jeff and the people in the administration are perhaps witness for the prosecution A on this, the South Africans are deceitful and duplicitous, the South African government. The Reagan administration went way out on a limb for them in connection with the Nkomati Accords, in connection with the negotiations with Angola. And every time the South African government has given its word, they have broken it, not only to the South African blacks that they've negotiated with on occasion, but also to their best friends in the Western Hemisphere, the Reagan administration. They are deeply racist, in our view, in their approach to all the problems. And the real issue at stake in South Africa, don't make any mistake about it, is power. And the question of how you negotiate power is something that the South African white community knows very, very well. You don't negotiate it. You don't give it up voluntarily. It must be taken from them. Or it must be more costly for them to maintain that kind of power than it is for them to give it up gradually through some kind of process, or ultimately, if they are unwilling to give it up through that kind of process, then through violence. And this is where I think we have problems with this approach that Jeff has been describing. We, of course, would be in favor of negotiations. We are in favor of nonviolent solutions to the problems of South Africa. The problem with negotiations is that the man that uses the word more, there's the one man that uses the word more than Chester Crocker and Schultz when it comes to negotiations is P.W. Botha. But the notion of negotiations for him is entirely different from our concept of what Roger Fisher tells you negotiations are, because there's got to be some common understanding of what the problem is that you're going to resolve. And that question is how there is a transition of power from a small minority of people to all people inside the country over a period of time. That sense of negotiations, that common element that requires that understanding for negotiations, I think, to go forward is not there. The real question for the United States, it seems to me, is how you maintain in our foreign policy towards South Africa interests and ideals that are true to the United States of America in terms of our fundamental principles upon which we are based, at the same time that you pursue our national interests. And it seems to me those coincide with a very aggressive and positive anti-apartheid policy that probably would consist of 3 elements, which would probably be classic: carrot, stick, process elements. I think we should have a much, much stronger stick in place than we do now. The problem with the executive order was not the content of the executive order so much as the timing of the executive order. Once you're involved in sort of the political process, you are told that the first three laws of politics is timing, timing, and timing. If President Reagan had announced his executive order the day after P.W. Botha gave his speech in Durban, it would have been a response that all Americans would have been supportive of, I think. But as it was, he announced it the 11th hour before the Senate overwhelmingly was going to pass very good, balanced, but strong legislation that would send a strong signal. So it came in as it was portrayed as President Reagan protecting, once again, the government of South Africa from the people of the United States through the representatives in Congress. And so the timing of the executive order, I think, vitiated any psychological message that was intended to be sent, I'm sure, by the President, certainly was intended to be sent by the members of the House and the Senate, that apartheid is unconscionable. The United States will not even allow itself to be perceived to be indulging apartheid. Now, the big stick that I think we should hold out at this point is a very credible threat that if apartheid has not been dismantled in significant ways within 18 months, that significant sanctions would be imposed, such as a wholesale trade embargo, such as mandatory economic sanctions at the UN, such as stronger disinvestment policies, maybe on a federal level. But at the same time, I think there should also be a very big carrot, that if in fact there are steps made by the South African government towards this kind of dismantling of apartheid, then in fact there will be efforts by the United States government to assist through financial means, either assisting intelligent investment or reform-minded and anti-apartheid investment, trade credits or things like that, but essentially having a credible carrot at the end of that. And the third element is the process. It seems to me one of the major problems of our approach over the last 4 or 5 years is that we have been playing white politics in South Africa. We have been mesmerized, if not hypnotized, by the interstices of the cabinet politics in the nationalist government. Who's going to be the successor to P.W. Botha? Is Gerrit Viljoen really a reformist? Is he going to bring the Broederbond along with him to these significant reforms? What is the significance of de Klerk's cabinet revolution just before the Durban speech? To what extent is reform really going to be possible under P.W. Botha? Is P.W. Botha a reformer, or is he really a reactionary holding off the tide of reform? It seems to me that is a dead-end street. And what we have to do is identify ourselves with all the forces that are struggling for against apartheid in South Africa, maintaining our commitment to nonviolence. We should be talking to, we should be dealing with the ANC on a daily basis. I'm sure one day Thabo Mbeki is going to be president of South Africa, and Phil Christensen will not be welcome in Pretoria unless we are able to talk with him, unless Phil is able to meet with him, unless the United States government openly and freely admits that we are having negotiations. We are taking advice, we are consulting with the ANC on how to promote peaceful and nonviolent change in South Africa. This is the direction I think we should go. I think there's no difference in ends. I think there's a massive difference in the view as to what is necessary to make that kind of change occur.
Thank you very much, Greg. Third speaker is a former member of the Foreign Service. He has worked on South Africa's problems since 1976. He's with the Commerce Department, dealing with our trade issues for a number of years. Associate Director of the United States South African Exchange Program in 79-80. Since 1981, he has been on the professional staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was appointed there jointly by two Republican senators, Senator Nancy Katzenbaum and Richard Lugar. And he's the principal Republican staffer on Capitol Hill on African policy. Mr. Phil Christensen. Phil, that's a pretty good title, isn't that a pretty good title? Phil.
Thank you very much. In working on South Africa policy for so long, I guess I've heard an awful lot of the arguments that have gone before on this subject. I'd like to say that it's my feeling, and it certainly was the feelings of those who I work for, that constructive engagement was a good policy in 1981. By 1983, it was clear that constructive engagement wasn't as good as a policy as we thought it was, and that changes were necessary. Senator Kassebaum, wrote to the administration after taking a trip to South Africa in 1983, saying, quiet diplomacy is nice, but you need to do a little bit more. You need to be a good deal more visible. We were ignored. 1984 rolled around, and obviously in a presidential election, it's not exactly the time for Republicans to start fighting among each other. But immediately after the election, Senator Kassebaum and Senator Lugar wrote to President Reagan, arguing with him that this issue needed his personal attention. I guess we can claim success because in July of 1985, President Reagan held the first National Security Council meeting ever held in the Reagan administration on South Africa, at which time he told the State Department that it was nice to hear their ideas, that he agreed with those ideas, but they better try to explain it to the American public. By September, he held a two-day review of his policy and the State Department's ability to sell it to the American public, and that's when the executive order was issued. But constructive engagement as a theory, I think, is really the fundamental policy the United States should be following towards South Africa. In basic point, I do believe very strongly that the issue of apartheid is an issue which should engage us. We should be, as the Frenchmen, the existentialists say, engagé with the issue of apartheid.
Disinvestment. And the alternative, I take it, the white government sees is, would we rather have the risk of disinvestment or the risk of total loss of power? And they may well prefer disinvestment to total loss of power. If the notion of, you're a variation on carrot and stick, deadline, total elimination, but we can't run South Africa, and how do we arrange it so that during a time period it is to the interest of this regime, which you have described, how do we arrange it so it's to their interest to move? I'll give you, for example, I think that if they could give in, if we get some of the Afrikaner businessmen to have a highly conspicuous 5-point plan, it might reduce the cost to them of going along with it. Rather than going into foreigners or black violence, they could do something. How do we make it easier for them to move rapidly in the direction? I don't think so. I haven't got it. When Greg simply said, well, your policy didn't work either. I didn't have the other policy, Greg, but anyway, he was not defending this as saying, well, other policies haven't worked, let's try it. But I think the theory of how an outside government influences significant change in a foreign government that we desperately want, but which is going to require painful choices by the people now in power. How do we do that? What's the theory?
What are the painful choices that you're making reference to? And why are they
give
painful?
up a lot of well-being, a lot of political control, and I take it they've got a fear of chaos.
Well, I don't think that they really have a choice. That's where I would come from, and that's why I wanted to know what you meant by painful. The reality is that they're going to have to, and this word, give it up. Again, there's this notion that somehow if you share the power and the various dignities and rights and freedoms that whites enjoy in South Africa, that these whites are giving it up to someone else. I don't look at it upon and that what you're giving it up to somehow is going to create something less than what you've got. I think that notion is somewhat racist and arrogant in the sense that it says all whites therefore have a monopoly on how to run countries or how to control power, and that there are not the blacks there that can. It was Bishop Tutu, I once heard him make mention about South Africa being like a table set with your finest china, and it is on the edge of the table. It is not the notion of the black South Africans to simply pull the tablecloth so that the china tumbles over the edge, But what they want to do is move the China to the middle of the table so that everyone can sit down and share in these benefits. My suggestion among one is that it should be a peace process, much like we would enter into a peace process with the Middle East. Let's take a book out of the at the time of say the late 40s when Israel was being formulated, and that is an international body of governmental representatives should come together and mediate between legitimate black leadership in South Africa and that of the white government. My second suggestion, because I'm one that firmly believes that the South African government understands the importance of money and capital and investment, that a similar delegation of international corporate leaders should in fact meet with legitimate black leadership, much the same way that corporate leaders and business leaders in South Africa met with so-called African rebels a few weeks ago or about a month ago. Even though there was not a great deal accomplished, but at least the dialogue began, and I think there became an understanding. Those would be my two recommendations.
Those are good process questions. One final question. Now, we're going to open in 2 minutes. We're going to have questions. Members of the audience, there's a microphone there. We'll start with your question. But first, Greg.
Comment. Jeff wanted some advice from Jeremy Bentham. How utilitarian process or sanctions could change South Africa. I think the proposition that Jeremy Bentham would come up with would be that the way in which you induce change among the white leadership in South Africa is to make the maintenance of apartheid more painful than the elimination of apartheid. And then the question is, how can we help do that? Now, I suggest to you that it's a combination of external and internal factors. But one of the things that has changed the chemistry, I think, recently has been the incredible impact that the American banks had when they refused to roll over the debt. That was something that is unprecedented, and the myth that the South African economy is invulnerable to external forces was shattered within the space of 24 hours.
All right, let's now go to your questions. You've been very,
I
one
make
quick.
a point about that. And one of the interesting factors about the action by the banks was that the South African government never explained to the people of South Africa why their currency collapsed. Never once explained the external impact that decision brought about that decision. So you're dealing with a government that I'm here to say that is not only lying to the world, but it in fact is lying to the people. And I firmly believe that if white South Africans understood the high cost of keeping blacks at the bottom, that there would be an internal effort that would not just be on the part of the violence that you see in townships. And let's understand that violence in townships too. One of the reasons it takes place in townships is because anyone that's ever been to South Africa knows that your urban areas are basically highly secured. That the violence is striking within the townships where in fact the impact can be felt the greatest. And I'm not here to uphold that violence. And also keep in mind that you're talking about that 50% of the black population in South Africa is under the age of 15 years old. So we're not talking about something that's going to go away overnight, and we're not talking about, and we're talking about really sitting down as quickly as possible with that legitimate leadership, black leadership, before that so-called legitimate black leadership loses control of that very youthful population, if they haven't already.
We will have questions now from the audience. Thank you for your patience. You may address them to one of the panelists, Mr. Madison, Mr. Christensen, Mr. David Auer, Mr. Craig, or you may address them to the panel and we'll take our chances. First question.
Do you want identifications?
Yes, you might help.
My name is Lee Ferris, and I'm a political science student, PhD student from MIT. I very much support the formulation of the U.S. decision about what kinds of pressure to bring to bear as being a utilitarian one. How do you raise the costs to get the benefits that you want? There are kinds of costs that could be discussed that haven't even been mentioned here. And in general, I could characterize the discussion as ranging from sort of moderate to liberal, without a sort of further to the left discussion being presented. South Africa is permitted in our papers to take full-page ads in the Boston Globe that a lot of people take offense with, that are full of lies that imply that things are fully integrated there and life is great for everyone. Does the U.S. Chamber of Commerce take ads like that in South Africa to present a U.S. point of view about why apartheid is wrong? No, they don't. The U.S. government, nor any of its bodies, such as of American bodies such as the Chamber of Commerce, do not take any actions to go directly to the South African people and try and get around this blockade of information that the government sets up about what apartheid is really doing. That's one thing that would raise the costs more. It's been in our newspapers frequently that when we had the riots in South Africa every day on the front page here, that they weren't on the front page there, and that lots of white citizens in South Africa didn't know about them. Secondly, even more strong possibilities. President Reagan is all gung-ho over the freedom fighters in Nicaragua, so-called. Well, I mean, I take a lot of objection to that description of those people that he's perfectly willing to give money to. He only went for the so-called humanitarian aid because he couldn't get anything else. No one in the United States ever talks about similar kinds of funding of forces of resistance in South Africa. I think that when you bargain, that you put out something extreme and then you come to the middle. So if you want to get where you want to be in the middle, you have to put out the strongest possible option in order to get where you want.
Okay, fine. Thank you. You want to comment on that, Phil?
I thought about that a lot. We have a problem in communicating with South African blacks and whites, which is that the government of South Africa owns the radio and the television network. We have a VOA station in Botswana which broadcasts on shortwave radio. The South African government doesn't allow shortwave radios to be manufactured in the country and has a very high duty on imported shortwave radios, so we're not reaching a lot of people there. And then the newspapers are basically government-supporting newspapers. So it's a real challenge for this administration or any other administration to try to get its message across about what our policy is and what we think about apartheid, because we're going through a filter which is not of our choosing.
Let's have our State Department. If we can have Radio Marty broadcasting to Cuba in large quantities, can we have a comparable communication with the South African population, giving them the hard facts, as you've suggested? Joe?
Yeah, I really think we should. And I'm surprised to hear this about the radio in Botswana, because we had tried for several years. Now we are building a new, and this is an informational question. I know we're building a new transmitter in Botswana. Will that rectify that situation?
It's going to give us bad reception in Johannesburg. That's going to be that's our best.
Well, if we're not doing it, then we're screwing up, and we should do it. We better find a way.
Get one good agreement here.
It's symptomatic of how clever the South African government is. They do not want their people to be listening to other people's news broadcasts, so they basically make it impossible to have a shortwave radio.
We actually know more in this country about the impacts of apartheid and what's going on right now. Well, for example, can you imagine having a riot in Boston and people in Cambridge not knowing about it? Because you can. Because the news cameras don't go into the townships of Soweto. They don't go into the townships and blast the 6 o'clock news. This is what has happened in the townships and the riots. Do you realize the #1 TV show, and it'll make sense when I mention it, the #1 TV show and the #1 hero in South Africa right now among the whites is the A-Team and Mr. T. And my point is that they think, it's the whole sneaky approach of making blacks look a certain way, and at the same time keeping them totally removed from the violence that is taking place. So therefore, the people of South Africa are saying, because the government has told us all of this time that the problems with blacks are really homeland problems and their own political problems, then it has really nothing to do with you, and they sort of wipe their hands out of it. So that's why I would go back again to, I think, those people who do have influence in South Africa, which are, one, our government officials, and two, our corporate international leaders, are really the way to filter into the South African people.
There seems to be one issue on which there's general agreement that the government, the United States, corporations and government, might do better in getting information around South Africa about facts and truth. Next question, please.
My name is Pia Lopez. I was a teacher in Southern Africa for 4 years. I'd like to make a comment on Mr. Madison's remarks that that the whites are ignorant in South Africa. I think that if they're ignorant, that it's because they want to be ignorant. Aside from that, my question would be addressed to any of the members on the panel. All of you have expressed faith in either peace negotiations or any kind of negotiations at all. Do you think that that there's enough community of interest between whites, blacks, and other people in Southern Africa for them to gain enough consensus to even rule effectively in a unitary state at all?
Is the goal of a unitary state realistic? Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. The question that Pia asked about whether there is enough consensus there, and I think it is not necessarily simply romantic to believe that people of different racial groups can get together and organize themselves to run a society. I think we have to operate on that hope, frankly. On the question of what type of government would emerge from negotiations that we're all in one way or another advocating, I think that has to be an open question. It seems to me that at least at the outset, the first step of true democracy in South Africa is not going to be one man, one vote in a unitary state, because that's not going to be saleable to whites. There are, in the world today, I'm told, and Roger, you may know, 20 different forms of federalism. And some of those types of federalism in places such as Mauritius or Malaysia or other places specifically take into consideration ethnic questions. And there may have to be, as objectionable as it is to us as Americans to think in these terms, there may have to be new political structures in South Africa which will move that country more towards democracy that are ethnic in nature. And I am not in this, and let me rush to state, endorsing homeland concepts or anything like the Bantustans. We may have to see democracy come in bits and pieces. There is, it seems to me, more of a chance in Natal province, where the possibility of some sort of federation between KwaZulu and the Natal province is a possibility. That wouldn't be perfect, it would be racially divided, but it is a way of moving things along. So I guess what I'm saying is that I still think there is a possibility, but we can't be simplistic about it. Ethnic divisions around the world in many societies have proven to be the rocks on which democracy is founded.
Great.
Let me just agree with the rather pessimistic premise at the heart of your question, which caused me to differ a little bit with Jeff's initial comments. It's not just that the South African whites don't know how to solve their problems or negotiate evolutionary solutions, and it's not going to be solved by sending everybody up to Roger Fisher's class in conflict resolution. There are fundamental disputes about fundamental questions that exist that I don't think we ought to recognize can be resolved simply by reasonable people sitting down at a table and talking back and forth about it. There is no consensus, at least in my view, among the white community in South Africa that apartheid is over with. I think the problem there still is that there's a good number of people there who will fight to the death to maintain it. Maybe it's going to have a different name, but they will put their lives and the lives of their children in jeopardy to protect it. And it is true that one of the great attacks on the P.W. Botha regime comes from the right in the white community there, who are saying that his slogan of adapt or die is really adapt and die. And they're gathering more and more forces. So I'm not sure where the white community is on this. I know that there's a good, solid consensus for change, but I don't know how real that is.
And Greg, that very question is, if the blacks see themselves being asked to accept a continuation of this regime, the whites, as you say it, hear themselves being asked to die. And their willingness to move is if something short of that, something short of their survival is at stake. And if apartheid had had 14% white and 86% of the territories and resources were turned over to the blacks, our feeling would be quite different. And they could still have a safe enclave of a local white tribal land. I'm not so opposed to Bantustan if they want a little white Bantustan somewhere. I think it might be a moderate in between step. But if you have a confederation,
that's his platform.
but the notion that if you have a confederation of 20 or more states, which there's some power for some government otherwise, you have to give an opportunity, it seems to me, that's something other than the one you're offering them. Well, let's go to our next. I won't give you any. Great, yes, all right.
The South African government policy, as far as I can tell, is to move to a federation of 8 provinces, eight new provinces instead of 4 old provinces. And within each province, each of the provinces would be allowed to create its own type of government and work out its own ethnic divisions. And they're willing to experiment with Natal province. Why? Because Chief Buthelezi has already taken over Natal. I mean, if you're a white businessman or a white government official in Natal province, and you're going to do something, you better go up and talk to Chief Buthelezi, because if he doesn't agree with you, he'll put you out of business. I mean, you know, Mobil Oil Company, if they want to have a new personnel policies, they kind of chatted over with Buthelezi, because if he calls his workers out, they don't refine any oil that day. And so he's already taken over, and he's gonna try this experiment. Let's hope it works.
Next question.
My name is Keating Wilcox. I live in Hamilton. I have questions for Jeff. Jeff, what do you think the administration would do if, number one, the Botha regime was successful in moving all the black citizens of South Africa to homelands? Just move them out en masse. My second question is, if war broke out between South Africa and a neighbor, and South Africa were first to use nuclear weapons, what would the administration policy be then? And third, what would happen if a Soviet client state, North Korea, East Germany, reinforced Angola and began to successfully invade and fight against South Africa? Would the administration intervene in any fashion there?
Well, now, we're not asking for official government policy positions on each of these questions.
No, yes. Yes, that's no. I'm joking. Let me answer your questions. What would the administration's position if the Botha regime physically moved out all blacks from to the homeland? We would be appalled. We don't like the homeland ideas. It's an absolutely ridiculous idea, and it's the truth here is that the reason change, be it what it is or as limited as it is coming in South Africa, is because the South African government and the South African business leaders recognize that this old concept that somehow blacks are not an integral element of a modern-day South Africa is kaput. They've given that up. They realize they can't run a 20th or a 21st century economy based on an 18th century social model. So if it were to happen, I think it would be a horrible thing. It would be a massive violation of human rights, even greater than we see in South Africa today, but I just don't think it's in the cards. I'm sorry, I lost track of the second question.
Nuclear weapons. Appalled again.
I goddamn right we'd be appalled, yeah. we'd be as appalled as we would be for any nation in this world to use nuclear weapons. And I mean, I think that just goes without saying.
How about if a Soviet puppet state were supporting Angola, invading, moving in more militarily
Into South Africa.
into South Africa?
I think the fact of life is, in this country, and I personally think it's a good fact of life, there is certainly no consensus in this country to come to the aid of South Africa, of a white regime in South Africa that is, by definition, an unjust and undemocratic regime. And so I don't think anybody in this country will be taken seriously should they advocate that. The fact of the matter is, however, is that the administration is concerned about Soviet encroachment in southern Africa. The way to fight Soviet encroachment, I think we'd all agree on that, especially in South Africa, is to have that society changed. And it's got to do it quick.
Thank you very much. Next question, please.
In a way, this gentleman anticipated my question. But before that, I'd like to make a few statements. With regard to your reference to surrogate troops from Cuba being surrogates of the Soviet Union, I was there. They are not surrogates. They are Cubans. And also, I want you to understand that they were invited to Angola by Angola using her sovereign rights as a nation. And if you remember very correctly, shortly after that, Fidel Castro made a speech in which he said that the people of Cuba have African blood, so they'll go to any lengths to help any African nation that asks them for help. I am an African, St. John's, Cambridge, University College London. I have been here for more than 10 years, but I do not consider myself as an expert on American affairs, and I hope no one ever refers to me as an expert on American affairs, even though you may go over to Africa and spend 2 years and come away and be described as an expert on African affairs. So that being put aside, last year, Edward Heath, former Prime Minister of England, of Britain, United Kingdom, Julius Nyerere, President of Tanzania and about to retire, and Lord Carrington made certain statements with regard to the Soviet Union. Edward Heath said in Johannesburg, warning the Boers, that if they expect the West to come to their aid by crying communist imperialism, they are mistaken. The West won't do it. Julius Nyerere last year went on a tour of Europe, Germany, Scandinavian countries, and Canada. And he said to the effect that they and Mozambique have a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union that will obligate the Soviet Union if they request the Soviet Union to provide them with arms and training. Now, the point that I wish to make is that what are you going to do, you in the State Department or you here? Are you going to send an army of mercenaries? If the occasion comes that Tanzania and Mozambique or Angola exercise their sovereign rights and request help from whoever they deem would like to help them. So far, you haven't produced a leader who has the guts to say that, look here, there are Americans here who have the blood of Africans in them and will do anything for them. You don't have the guts. What are you going to do if the Soviet Union decides to intervene on behalf of Mozambique, Angola, if they are asked to? There is already, if you wish to know, Korean troops of brigade strength in Zimbabwe, North Korean.
We have your answer, I think. No one is going to...
I think I'm throwing that question to all of you over there.
That's right. I'm going to let the others make a quick answer to the more direct Soviet troops who are involved in southern Africa. What would the United States do?
There are already North Korean troops of brigade strength.
If they were fighting involving such troops, Do you disagree with Jeff Datenow saying no one would intervene on behalf of South African government? Right? You disagree?
I agree.
You
You
agree?
see, you discussed this for over an hour, and you never mentioned the fact, and you from the State Department ought to know that somewhere in your files, there must be that treaty that was signed at independence between Mozambique and the Soviet Union.
Okay, so let me answer your question, because I think you've raised a lot of points, and it deals with the regional issue in Southern Africa, and I think it's a little off the mark for this group, but
I don't think so.
let me just say, the Soviet Union has, over the past 4 to 5 years, given about $200 to $300 million worth of military equipment to Mozambique. Mozambique has been punished by having its president forced to come to the White House and have lunch with President Reagan just last month. I'm being facetious here. The point is this: we recognize the right of Mozambique to get arms where it can. Our diplomacy in Southern Africa on a regional basis seeks to limit Soviet influence through diplomatic means. We are trying to negotiate a resolution to the problems of the southwestern portions of Africa by getting South Africans out of Namibia in return for getting Cubans out of Angola. I don't buy the answer that the Cubans are there as independent actors. The Cubans don't send 35,000 people halfway around the world alone. Secondly, in Mozambique, our relations with that country have improved markedly in the past few years because we are trying to deal with them in a diplomatic and open manner, trying to bring them closer to true non-alignment. And I think that is happening in Mozambique, because everywhere in Africa, people are realizing that you can get guns from the Soviets. The MPLA regime has, over the last 2 years, got probably a couple of $2 billion worth of Soviet armament to fight or prosecute a civil war in the country of Angola. That's all the Soviets are good for. They can give you guns. If it comes to aid, if it comes to trade, if it comes to national development, the countries of Africa are turning
Well, let
westward.
me tell you something that
And there is not a North Korean brigade in Zimbabwe.
No, that
That's a
we
fact.
see.
We have a question waiting behind
Yeah, that
you.
we
We've got
see.
several questions.
That we say among ourselves. That
I
the
think
Soviets
You've asked a question for our
they make very
panelists.
good tanks,
Two
but
of them-
lousy typewriters.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your participation. You
Yes,
asked 4 of our
but,
panelists a question. You've
whoever
got
is
2
it?
answer. Do you want to answer this question?
Show
Bill?
us within the last 4 years one instance of success in your policy. It's met with nothing but colossal failure. No one in the Organization of African Unity looks up to you.
Thank you very much. We have a next question, please.
Hi. I've gotten the feeling from listening to all the panelists that that all of you seem to agree about the ends, but you differ in degrees as to how to go about it. But I keep getting the sense that we all feel like the United States is constrained. We can't change people. And I have a lot of problems with that because, first of all, we are a superpower. Second, in Latin America, for much less worthy reasons, we have gone to greater extents, and we're talking about the mining of the Nicaraguan ports, though I'm not advocating that. But basically what I'm trying to say is that I get a sense that there's not enough of a commitment with this issue, that we're walking very softly, we're trying to not push around anybody. And I wonder, our national security interests, what role do they play? We haven't really mentioned them tonight. Is it South Africa's strategic minerals, their geographic location? What is the balance between our national interest and human rights? Because I think the U.S. does have the power to influence. It's whether it wants to commit it or not.
How would you do it?
Well, that's why you have those jobs. That's it's not easy.
I think that's what we're facing, is the difficulty of trying to do that. Anyone want to take on?
I just want to make
Greg?
one historical observation. One of the reasons Senator Kennedy decided to go on this trip to South Africa in January, he made the decision in late September and early October, was that there had been a series of events in August and September in the black townships that had gotten no attention in this country at all. We had had a presidential campaign in which no one had debated, other than Jesse Jackson mentioning it a couple times, no one had paid any attention to American policy towards South Africa. By the time he got there in January, the situation had changed considerably, in that we had Desmond Tutu receiving the Nobel Prize, and we had the demonstrations outside the South African embassy. But nonetheless, between the period of January of this year and July of this year, a 6-month period, there was an extraordinary development, which I think in recent history has been unprecedented, at least in the last 20 years or so, in terms of the change of approach and increased commitment to this issue in the United States Congress. When he came back, he introduced with Weicker a piece of legislation called the Anti-Apartheid Act. There were 12 co-sponsors. At that time, in January, February, and March, Senator Kassebaum, Senator Lugar was speaking throughout the country against sanctions. That was their position in February and March. Within 4 months after that, they were supporting sanctions. Now, a lot of that had to do with developments inside South Africa. A lot of it had to do with developments inside this country. But I think this change, this growth, this almost a wave of interest and opinion on this issue has really been quite phenomenal. The question is whether it's going to last.
Thank you. Next question, Mr. Conway.
It's Robert Conway. I run a program at the Center for International Affairs on South Africa, specifically how one tries to evolve new solutions to the South African question. I've just come back from South Africa. I was there for the last year during the state of emergency and everything else. So I'm running this program for a year, and I was in Cambridge for 2 years prior to that. And what struck me being in South Africa, which leads me to the comment or the question, is whether the panel feels they know enough or have enough of South Africa's views, South Africa's people's views and input about the situation there to have reached some of the conclusions and to reach the general feeling that they have so far. Because one thing that really struck me being back in South Africa when I asked this question to South Africans, do you understand what the American movement's about vis-a-vis South Africa? They've written it off. The majority of people in South Africa, and when I say that, it's not only a question of white versus black, as I hear so often from the panel this evening. It seems to be a question of the privileged people in South Africa versus the underprivileged. And amongst that privilege, there are a fair number of colored, Indian, and black people besides the white people. But my point is this. They've written American influence off virtually because they perceive the American situation as part of your own political debate on South Africa. And is that not emphasized, by what's going on here this evening? So the question is simply, in all honesty, do you feel you've got enough South African opinion? I think we've almost got some admission earlier on that you can't get into South Africa, you can't get your message across. It's a type of reverse question. I feel that you haven't, and if you were doing that, if you held a symposium, for instance, just in America, and got opinions from all people who are against apartheid and against the government system as to how to handle the situation, it might help you very, very constructively. There are just a few points that that have come up that I just want to mention quickly. The issue in South Africa, if we're talking about equating, as you so often seem to do, the South African government with the South African people, that's an absolute misnomer. The situation in South Africa has never been more fluid, and you have a tremendous opportunity, all of you, to influence a constituency in South Africa that is not pro-government, that is confused, and that is looking for alternate leadership to come from you. But often the question is asked that you can't offer that leadership, that you yourselves are too confused, not specific enough in what you want to happen there. The point was made that, in fact, South Africans or white South African government people are inherently racist, dishonest, bad, etc. These are huge statements to make. Might the question not be, even though I'm as against the government or as against apartheid as the person making that statement has done, might the question not be that those people generally, elitist in South Africa, are worried about their survival? And if you're coming up with other models or other ways in which you can ensure their survival, isn't that going to be a better way to influence them than the way the whole debate is going at the moment?
Well, I think that the debate really has been rather mild and sensible in the approach, because we've, at least from this chair's standpoint, I've made the notion that there is not an attempt, at least by the non-whites, to destroy what has really been there. In reference to statements about all whites being racist and liars and that type of thing, I too separate the government from the people. I think there's enough evidence to show that once the truth and information is projected and superimposed into South Africa and to the people, that they start to look at it from a different light. But what we've got to take under consideration, and I think be very candid about, is that the Afrikaners who are in power and have been in power since, 49, if I'm not mistaken, were primarily founded on the premise that whites were inherently superior to blacks, the whole Calvinist attitude, and that they and their laws have been directed towards that. That's why I laugh when we talk about more money into South Africa. Make it better for them. Just keep putting more money in there, and they'll do the right thing. The hell if they will. They haven't done the right thing since 1949, and just now we're seeing when things were going well. I mean, when there weren't sanctions, when there wasn't discussion, there was no effort. The only effort that's been made towards reform has been after, and I don't mean to be chauvinistic, ladies, as I think it was not one of my favorite people mentioned, that Richard Nixon said during the Watergate era, you grab them by their balls and their hearts and minds will follow. And I think that that's just exactly what we need to do to the government. And part of that is by circumventing around the government and getting as direct to the people as we possibly can.
Thank you. I've been under absolute instructions
Nixon didn't say that. It was
to close this program in 2 minutes. I will give my other panelists a chance for a final few seconds.
The first thing, we all have a lot to learn about views, and we should all pay a good deal of attention to people who offer their views. I think it's clear that a lot of people in this country do not understand South Africa, myself included. And if anyone had the impression that at least I was holding myself out as an expert, I want to disabuse them. I don't consider myself an expert at all. The second thing to be said, though, is and my remarks, by the way, about deceitful and dishonest, I would support with the record with respect to the government of South Africa in the last 5 years. I did not intend those remarks to refer to all white South Africans. The third thing I would say is that I do not think white South Africans, from what I get in touch with, have written off the United States of America and do not pay attention to us. They told us that in December when I was there, they told us that again in January when I was there, and every day, every newspaper carried more stories about what was going on in the United States of America, whether it was cultural or political. And the capital of the United States is covered intensely by South African reporters. I think they care enormously, whether it's because they like Americans and want to be liked by Americans, or whether they realize that their fate is inextricably intertwinkled, as an old law professor of mine used to say, with our country. But the other thing is that I think it's very hard for South African whites to learn, and that is that they are not going to be the only ones Americans listen to anymore. We are going to be listening to black South Africans as well. And so when we go over to South Africa and blacks tell us that they favor sanctions and they would like a much more aggressive and visible anti-apartheid action, we're going to respond, I think, more, at least my senator responded more to that appeal than when members of the Progressive Federal Party come over to Washington, D.C. and lobby against sanctions on the Hill.
Okay, I'm going to have to...
That's
Phil, final word?
I just agree with Greg on this. We're not exactly out of touch with South Africa. First of all, as a Senate staffer or a State Department official, you can go to South Africa quite a lot. You can also be on the receiving end of an enormous number of phone calls asking if you will meet with various South Africans. We're not, I don't think, acting out of ignorance. What is true, though, is that South Africans come to Washington and do have two different sides, and some of them will publicly come out and say they disagree with what you're doing when privately they told you they really liked your bill. I mean, they like the Kennedy bill as well as the Lugar bill, but I mean, they do like our bills.
Jeff?
I think I've talked enough.
Joe, last word?
I think that South Africa is at a crossroad, much the same way that JFK, during his inaugural speech indicated that Africa, during its era of shaking off colonialism, was at a crossroad. It's up to us to export democracy, to show them that the best choice, the choice between communism or democracy, and you show them that choice by showing them how democracy truly can work for the masses of the people. This country ought to stop offering token gestures in an attempt to shake apartheid and offer real, concrete solutions and get itself on the side of the masses who will eventually, despite all the power that the white South African government claims they have, will eventually get their freedom because their hearts are in it, their mind are in it, their future is in it, and they're going to have their freedom one way or the other. It will become, I think as Malcolm X said 20 years ago, it is now a choice between the ballot or the bullet. Apartheid is dead. It's just a question of how expensive South Africa government wants to make the funeral.
Thank you, and we're going to now I'd ask you, thank you for your patience and ask you to join us in thanking our four speakers.